Okay, hi everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I was asked previously by my colleague, who is one of the directors for the Islamic Manuscript Association, to come and talk to you at this workshop about international law and heritage protection for archives in armed conflict. So obviously we only have 2 hours. That's a lot to cover. So mostly what I would like to do today is just introduce you to some of the key ideas to think about. And obviously I'm happy and available afterwards to answer any questions, or I'll give you my email, and anything you want to know more about, we're happy to help. So I'm just going to share my screen. I hope this works and you can all see it. Okay. So just to make you aware, I can't always see the chat, so I'm going to try and check on it. And if there's something you want me to see or know, I will try and notice, but just give me a little bit of time. So the workshop today was supposed to be delivered between myself. My name is Emma Cunliffe. I work for Blue Shield International, which is an organization dedicated to the protection of heritage in armed conflicts. We have national committees around the world. In the Middle East, currently, we only have a committee in Lebanon, but in Africa, we have committees in Mali, Cameroon, Senegal, one forming in Niger, one forming in Mozambique, and we're under discussions about forming committees in quite a lot of the rest of Africa at the moment. I was presenting the workshop with Emily Lomas, who is an archives and records management consultant, but she also is the disaster manager for the International Council of Archives. Unfortunately, she's in New Orleans and the recent hurricane knocked out the power. So when I get to her slides, I ask for your patience because this was the part she would have presented. So our goal today is to develop an understanding of international law and its relevance to heritage protection, just an introduction, to develop understanding of the threats to heritage in crisis, to develop an understanding of, let's get that off your screen, an understanding of the threats and key measures to mitigate them, and just to look at some really simple exercises to prevent threats. So we're going to start just briefly with the disaster risk cycle, a very short exercise about disaster response, which will put you in breakout rooms, but that's only meant to be 5–10 minutes. Then we're going to talk a little bit about international law. I'm going to give you a case study for risk management in conflict to show why it's different to the normal risk management you might be more familiar with. And then a couple of exercises about evacuation and planning. As I said, these are more tasters to give you an idea. So starting with disaster and risk. The risk mitigation cycle has 4 key stages. It starts with, you can start at any point, but the idea is that you prepare. You prepare for what might happen. And if you are prepared, you can mitigate what might happen. And that means that when it happens, you're able to respond to it. And in turn, that means you are able to recover from it. And then building on the lessons that you learned when you recovered from the last disaster, because they will happen, you prepare again and you feed that knowledge back in to improve response next time. So we're actually going to go straight in at the end. What happens in a disaster? And what I would like people to think about is you're about to go into breakout rooms. I'm going to show you a picture of a disaster. And my idea is that you will just together as a group talk very briefly to do an assessment of the area. Think very quickly, not in detail, maybe your first ideas for your first steps. How would you conduct a damage assessment? What supplies would you need in this disaster? It's only supposed to be for 10 minutes in groups, just first impressions, to think about how prepared you would be if you came into work the next day and this is what you found. And this might be a flood, it might be a tornado, it might be a fire, it might be a bomb. It doesn't matter for this why it happened. But I just want you in groups to think about why it's happened and what you would do. Sorry, to think about your responses to it. And then in 10 minutes, you should have one person in each group who feeds back to the rest of us. And that should just be for 10 minutes, for 2 minutes each group, just very short overview of what your key thoughts were. So hopefully this will work. This is our new test of the technology to put you into these groups for 10 minutes to consider this picture and what you would do if you were confronted with that. What supplies do you need, and how would you even begin to start? What are the most important tasks? Hi, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Also, just to remind people, you need to reconnect the translation if you haven't. And thank you to our wonderful translators. Thank you for bearing with us while I figure out the technology of breakout rooms. I'm not that familiar with it. So I suppose my first question is just a general idea to see people. You have the reaction on Zoom. Just show me a reaction to get a picture of how comfortable you all felt with that. I mean, did you look at that and think, oh no, what would I do? Or did you look at that and go, I could handle this? Just press a reaction to give me an idea.
What I'm saying that it is a very tragic and horrible scene.
So, okay, we have some reactions coming in. I think it is an awful thing to see when this happens, but obviously it's a real picture. So I had 3 breakout groups. I'm gonna have to ask the organizers now to help me slightly with which one breakout group was, to ask breakout group 1 to feedback for a couple of minutes. One was one of the 2 Arabic groups. If I can ask somebody from one of the Arabic groups, just a couple of minutes to say whether you were prepared, whether you thought you could, whether you would know what to do if you came into work and saw that.
مش على الصورة.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
أنا دكتور شريف الأنصاري، مكتبة اسكندرية. بالفعل أنا كنت على علم أو عامل حسابي على الأقل إنه سوف يكون نوع من الأزمات، فبقسم الأزمة دي قبل الأزمة وبعد الأزمة. وفي تصوري إن في قبل الأزمة في 3 نقاط: 1، يتم تجهيز الأماكن المخصصة لحفظ المخطوطات والميكروفيلم من الحريق والكوارث الطبيعية. 2، عمل نسخ احتياطية من المخطوطات والوثائق والكتب النادرة وحفظها في مكان آخر. توضع هذه النسخة الاحتياطية في مكان خارج المكتبة أو على سيرفر خاص خارج المكان. بعد الأزمة في عدة خطوات أيضا. أولى هذه الخطوات جمع الأوراق المتبقية، نقل الأوراق إلى مكان آخر، تجهيزها للترميم. 3، يتم تقسيم الوثائق والمخطوطات والخرائط كل على حدة وتجهيزها للترميم. وشكرا لحضراتكم.
Okay, I like that. That's really good. You've obviously thought about where your inventory would be, the need not to have it on site. That's really important, and I will be coming back to that later. Thank you. Can I ask group 2? I think that group 2 is the English speaking group.
I think in preparation in case any disaster happens, we have to search and identify the vulnerable and weak areas that could be affected by any disaster. And also, before any disaster happens, we have to take a full copy of our all our manuscript collections. And also, it is beneficial to save and put our collections in a protected area before any disaster that happens. We have also to put it in an area that appropriate or that has appropriate temperature degree.
Out of curiosity, in a disaster, if the power went and you have no electricity, do you have a backup generator for your environment controls for the temperature?
Yes, it is absolutely right. We have to have a generator in case any electricity that cut. We have to prepare in such cases.
Thank you. And group 3?
Oui.
Yeah. Group 3?
بالنسبة لهذه الحالة أعتقد أن قبل التأمين المكان لابد يكون لدي نسخة أو أكثر من نسخة خارجيا، ويتم وضعها في مكان مصفح أو مجهز أو محمي جيدا من حيث الكهرباء ومن حيث طفايات الحريق الهيوميديتي. وفي حالة قطع التيار الكهربائي يتم الاتصال جنريشن عشان الحفاظ على الأتموسفير للحجرة إلى أن يتم التعامل معها. أما عند حدوث هذه الأزمة أو الكارثة يتم جرد كل ما هو محتوي وتجهيز المكان مرة أخرى، ويتم تقسيمه حسب هذه الحالات. وبعد ذلك بعد تجهيز المكان يتم بعد ذلك المقارنة بالنسخة الأصلية المحفوظة خارجيا وما وصلت إليه هذه الحالة. ويتم عمل ومعرفة ما هي الكوارث أو التي أدت إلى ذلك وتجنبها المرة القادمة. لأنها كوارث تكنيكية وكوارث طبيعية في نفس الوقت. في بعض البلاد يحدث أمطار، أعاصير، انقطاع كهربائي، فبالتالي هذه كوارث طبيعية. فلا بد من التعامل مع الكوارث الطبيعية وكوارث المادية في حد ذاتها.
Thank you. That's really helpful, partly for me because I did not know who would come today, and that gives me a good idea of how well prepared you all are. the answer is very, and that's great. So what I want to do now then is talk a little bit about conflict and why that's not the same as normal disaster preparations. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit with a short exercise. This didn't really work before. I'm going to try it again. You all have a react button on Zoom at the bottom. It's the icon that has a little face on it, and you can use it to do, thumbs up or thumbs down, just to say, yes, I know this, or no, I don't. And what I'm going to do now is just get a little bit of an idea of what people know or don't know about international law. And so my first question, actually, exactly like that. Yes, somebody has done that. Please all do that. If you look at the little grid screen of speakers, of everybody attending, you can see reactions. So my first question is, how many people in this room, hopefully lots, but you never know, how many people have heard of the 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict? They have 3 thumbs. I'm hoping there are more than just 3 people. 4. 1 down. Okay. So we've got a few answers there. Okay, that is the main piece of international law protecting heritage in armed conflict. It's signed by 133 countries. So almost anybody fighting has signed this law. And talk a little bit about it. And so questions, for example, does international law protect cultural property like archives in conflict? Yes, it does, obviously. Is it always protected in conflict? Because I hear a lot that people say, well, this bill, you must never target cultural property in conflict. So which the answer is no, there are circumstances you are allowed to do that. If an enemy uses cultural property, like if they make your archive a military base, somebody is legally allowed to target it. And that's unfortunate, but it's the way it is. And so now we come to the really important questions in conflict. Whose job is it to protect cultural property in international law? And the answer is both, it's a military job, but it's also a civilian job. And there are civilian responsibilities as well in law. Not everybody's heard of it, so I'm not going to ask if you know if your country has signed it. There are 133 signatories, including Egypt. Egypt has signed. And so this is a binding law in Egypt and most places. Does anybody recognize this symbol? This blue shield, which is what my organization is named after. Any thumbs up? Couple. Okay. So this is the blue shield. It is the equivalent of the Red Cross. The Red Cross protects people and hospitals and doctors. The blue shield indicates cultural property that is to be protected in the event of armed conflict. It is an internationally recognized symbol. Misusing it, like, to paint it on your house, can be a war crime. It is recognized by armed forces, not as much as it should be. A large part of my job is military training to inform people about this symbol and what it means. But if in any doubt, this is the symbol for protected cultural property. And you see it here on the right-hand side on this slide. This is the symbol they're putting up in Lebanon at the moment with a QR code. And the QR codes, one of them goes to our website and one of them goes to the UNESCO website. And you can see it on a building here in Argentina, I think. It might be Guatemala. That's terrible. I should know that. I think it's Argentina. Anyway, under the law, the protection of cultural property has two aspects. There's safeguarding and there's respect. So I want to talk to you more about safeguarding, because safeguarding is the civilian measures, and that's what you all need to be doing. So none of it's obligatory. Like, there are no things in the law that say you must do this. It says you must do safeguarding, but it's up to you what that looks like. Recommended measures, and I'll talk about those in more detail. Recommended measures include that there should be somebody in the government who will coordinate everything, who will help you evacuate collections to safe places. So, for example, if your city is in danger, taking a collection to the next building does not help. There should be somebody in government whose job it is to coordinate this. Many governments do not yet have that person, and that is a problem. But I'm highlighting the need for one here. You should have an inventory, what it is and where it is. And that's not just your collection, but also your building. If you cannot tell an armed force, this building is protected and it is in this place, they can't protect it. But as you already identified in disasters, you also need to know what is in your collection. Ideally, you should put blue shields on protected buildings. And that includes not only the building, but if you have a building that you will evacuate to, you can put a blue shield on the storage building as well. But these shields need to be placed with the permission of your government. You can't just put them on things, because somebody somewhere must take responsibility and say, yes, this is a real blue shield and not one that I put on my house. So it has to have government approval. And governments can register particularly important places for special or enhanced protection, which gives them improved protection in armed conflicts. And so, for example, there is a library in Italy, the National Library in Italy in Florence, has been registered for enhanced protection, which is the highest level of protection available in a conflict. So the three shields together means it's under special protection, and this red shield means that it's enhanced protection. But the one I want to perhaps talk most about, because a lot of these can only be done in liaison with government, but so the ones I want to talk most about are the measures you need to put in place for things that either cannot be moved or how you can prepare for evacuations. There are military measures, which respect means the military measures in an armed conflict. Basically, and very quickly, military forces should not use cultural property unless there is no other choice. They can use it if there is no other choice. They should not target it or damage it unless there is no other choice. So if they need to target it to win the conflict, for example, if somebody is using your building, or if they are storing large weapons next to it, they are allowed to target that weapon and it will damage your building, or they can target your building. And they are required to prevent looting and vandalism, but only by their own military forces. Military forces are not police. It's not their job to place guards around your museum, although in some circumstances, it might be useful for them to do that. Like, if they have the resources, often they will want to help if they can. So from a military perspective, you need to understand how and why armed forces think about heritage protection. They think about it very differently to us, the heritage professionals. They are not there to protect cultural property. Their job is to complete their mission. And for them, they have to think about risk, not about risk to your collection, but about the risk to the mission. If someone steals your collection and sells it, will they have money to buy guns? If somebody steals your collection, will they be forever famous in the news forever because they let that collection be looted and everybody will think less of them? But it's about the mission. So what will constrain their action? What limits their actions? And it has to occur at a speed that they can plan at, and that is very, very quick. And as heritage staff, we're very bad at doing things quickly, to be honest. It takes us a long time to prepare for things, and we have lots of meetings about them. And military people do things very, very quickly. So you need to be prepared to respond to that and have information ready in advance. Because if you don't have it when they ask for it, you've missed your chance. And so what I need to emphasize is that in a conflict, cultural property can only be protected if you already have the information and you've already planned. If you try to do it afterwards, it's too late. You're at that final stage, you're at disaster response. So what kind of mission risks do you need to help plan for? And if you talk to them about mission risks rather than heritage protection, you go a lot further. So illegal actions, no military force that is a good one wants an illegal action. They don't want to be accused of direct damage that wasn't necessary. They don't want to be accused of illegally using cultural property. And they, or perhaps an accidental fuel spillage. They don't want looting because looting means objects can be sold for guns and weapons. So they don't want financing of their enemies. They don't want negative communications about them. They don't want the international media going, wow, you're terrible. That reputation is important to people. Most soldiers consider themselves professionals. They don't want that loss of reputation. They don't want to find, though, that they can't maneuver anywhere because there's cultural property. So they need to know where it is. And one big concern for them, and this happens a lot in conflict, is that people will use cultural property to make them hesitate, to make the choices more difficult. So people use cultural buildings to put weapons in, and they use cultural buildings as communication points to force them to be drawn into the conflict. It's illegal, but it happens a lot. So people have to be prepared for that. So armed forces have to take all feasible precautions to identify cultural property. But what's feasible for them and what's feasible for us are very, very different. So a feasible precaution for them might just mean your Ministry of Defense goes to your Ministry of Culture and says, do you have a list of cultural property? And if you're on that list with the coordinates of your building, so the latitude and the longitude of the building, you're fine. And if you're not, then that was it. That is a feasible precaution. And I can tell you now from trying to collect coordinates for cultural property, the coordinates for libraries and archives are incredibly difficult to find. So you don't just need an inventory of your collection, you need to make sure your building is located on somebody's list. So that's a very, very quick introduction to international law and to present a different way of thinking about it as military risk. Because honestly, they don't care about heritage protection. They're there to win the fight. So if you can't talk to them about military risk, they don't want to know. So what does that mean? I'm going to give you a case study or few about managing risk. How do you do it? What is the threat? Is your site vulnerable? And how likely is it to happen? Hang on, where are we? Okay, yeah, okay. Threats and risks and vulnerabilities together make risk. So if your site has, so war is a threat or a hazard. It is not but it's not really a risk for me. My country is not at war. So I have to think about how likely a war is to happen and what the cost would be if there was a war to make up my mind about the risk. If it is, all right, sorry. It's very if it will be devastating if it occurs, even if it's quite unlikely, I should make a plan for that. If it's quite unlikely and it will have no impact, that is a very low risk. But it's the combination of what would happen if it occurs and how likely it is to occur with what the problem is that makes up risk. So you have to identify the risks and plan to mitigate them. Where are we? There we go. And there's lots of types of hazards. These were Emily's slides. There are lots of hazards. I'm going to skip them to talk about the National Museum of Aleppo as a case study. So unrest starts in Syria in 2011. And by late 2012, it's a formal conflict. There's a lot of fighting. But there's no point where somebody said, yes, today it is a war. It was not a war yesterday. It was very gradual, so nobody was prepared for it to turn into a war. It started just as demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations. And so you need to understand that war is very rarely something that happens it's not always something that happens very fast. And so when the fighting got bad quickly, the National Museum of Aleppo found itself completely unprepared. There were no guards, no inventories. They had nowhere to evacuate the collection to, no support, and no funding. And so with that, they had to work out how to protect the museum. And so this is from the articles by museum director Yusuf Kanju. So the first thing the staff did was go through and prioritize the collection. What was significant, what was important, and where could they store it? Their first assessment said the most likely problem was looting. So what can you do about that? They changed the gallery layout so people familiar with the museum could not find objects, and removed the 5% most important objects. They couldn't take everything, they had nowhere to put it, so they just took the most important ones off display. The government said they were not allowed to pack down the museum. That happens a lot. Governments often say, if a fight is coming, you cannot pack down the museum. Museum staff do it anyway, a lot of the time. So they moved all the objects into the basement, but there was no temperature control. So they needed generator pumps, which meant finding petrol in a war. So they needed to have petrol supplies in a war zone because otherwise the basement flooded. And you can see the flooding in the pictures here. The green is the water. And if you look at the cars at the back, the water level is very high. They sealed the doorways in the halls with metal doors and reinforced them with concrete. Anything that they could that was too big to move into the basement, they wrapped them in sandbags, bricked them up, and encased them with wood. And in these pictures, you see the garden with wooden statues in boxes. And you also see the entrance to the museum, all sandbagged and encased in wood. But also to prevent looting, museum employees, they had no guards. The museum staff moved into the museum. They slept there with the guards for years, literally years, to protect the museum, so that there were always people in there to stop armed gunmen coming in. Obviously, this is not good. And you can see in this picture that the roof is damaged and the windows are damaged. That museum did get hit by shells and people were injured living in the museum. So eventually they moved the museum pieces to the other side of Aleppo. 24,000 pieces had to be moved across Aleppo in the bombing with the shells falling. And in 2015, as the fighting got worse, they moved objects into Damascus. It's quite a long trip. Only a very small group of people knew about it. In fact, the museum director, about 3 staff, and some members of the police to guard them. And it took 13 hours and 2 trucks. The head of the Syrian Antiquities Authority said, "They were difficult hours. I will never forget them in my life. I was afraid for the lives of my colleagues on the way and for my museum collection, which could be stolen. But I had no choice but to make this difficult decision after the escalation of violence in all of Syria." So the point I want to make here really is that in an ideal world, you need to evacuate collections to somewhere safe much earlier. You don't want to find yourselves in this position. So you need to think about what the condition is for the point at which you evacuate your collection. What is your trigger to say, now I must evacuate? And if you have a person in government willing to say that, there should be. I know in my country in World War II, we had somebody. Now today, the government says it will never happen. We don't need to make that choice. But in Iraq, they were told not to. In Cambodia, they were told not to. In another country I won't name, they were told not to. Same problem in Beirut in the Civil War. The National Museum had no plans or preparation. So the museum director and his wife hid objects behind walls in the museum basement. Every time they tried to sandbag up the large objects and use sandbags and wooden planks, the militia took the wooden planks and the sandbags, so they couldn't do that. So eventually they put them in concrete. But then the museum director died and he hadn't told anybody. For 20 years, no one knew where the museum's objects were. He did not record it, he did not write it down, and it took them 20 years to find out. They did not find these objects until 1996. But actually, because he walled them up, there was no temperature control, and a lot of the collection was very badly damaged by the lack of temperature controls. Same problem in Iraq. In Iraq, eventually Saddam Hussein said they were not allowed to pack down the National Museum. They did it anyway. And they painted a blue shield on the roof and put the collection in the basement because they weren't allowed to take it anywhere. And they had no support for planning to guard the collection. In another very recent conflict, the conflict moved very quickly. They didn't have any plans or preparation. And so they had plans to get the collection to an airport to fly it out. But as the enemy army came towards the city, the police ran, the looting increased of shops, of everything, very bad looting. And the museum director stayed at his museum till midnight to pack down his collection into boxes. And at midnight, he drove home. He was robbed 3 times on the way home, including his car. And so they realized there was no way, already it was too late, there was no way to transfer the collection to the airport. The trucks could not get there safely, and they'd left it too late. So the cultural property threats are different in conflict. There is obviously a direct threat to the buildings, structural damage caused by bombs, fire, looting, whether that is deliberate. For example, maybe somebody has seen something in your collection that they want, or maybe it's just people who want to earn some money quickly and they'll just steal things because it's there, opportunistic. But also neglect. What happens if you can't get to your building because of the fighting? And one day a pipe breaks, but nobody is there to see it. Or what happens if a bomb hits a pipe and water floods your building? What happens if the environment controls are knocked out? What do you plan for then? Evacuation is also much more complex because the roads might be busy. Perhaps there are refugees on the road. Perhaps there are no police and there is a lot of looting. Perhaps there is fighting in the area. It's very difficult to evacuate your collection. And many evacuation plans are just to a local building. If you need to get it out the area, do you have a backup plan that is away from the fighting? And so this lack of planning and preparation for conflict is critical, which brings us to plans. I can't tell you how to make a full disaster plan for a conflict in an hour or half an hour, but I'm trying to introduce you to the ways you need to think about a disaster plan, this kind of plan. So my first thought is just to ask you to pause, to each take a minute, just 1 minute. Imagine that actually it's too late. You have to evacuate your collection in a hurry. You have no space. What is the one most important item in your collection? Do you know what it is? What are perhaps the 10 most important items in the collection? Do you know what they are? Have you marked them? Do you know where they are? If a bomb hits your building and there is a fire, do the fire service know where they are? Perhaps have them marked with a red sticker and say these, and here is the map. Get these objects with red stickers on this map. These are the most important things. But what if it's the middle of the night? Do you need keys? Are there buildings that are locked? Who has the keys? How do you contact that person? Do you need volunteers? Do you have contact details for them? Are they trained? I just want you to think for a minute, if you could name the 10 most important things in your collection, that if you had to evacuate it overnight. I'm not, because we have 20 people, I'm not gonna ask for feedback on this. I just want you to have that question in your mind, that if you have no time, what do you take? Because honestly, it may come to that, and that is that forethought where you don't want to walk into your building and look at it and think, where do I start? What are my most important objects? What is it I should take with me? The other thing, actually, I think I meant to talk about this on the other slide, but one of the other things I just want to flag and highlight on looting is that the biggest risk for Islamic manuscripts is that looters will take them and they will separate them and they will sell them page by page because they are very valuable page by page. So you either need a way to keep them together where they cannot be separated, or have a very good record of the individual pages. So still in planning, do you know in your country who your competent authority is? Who in the government is responsible for this? And there may not be anybody. A lot of countries have done absolutely nothing with this law. And so we encourage people to work with their government, with their Ministry of Culture for this. A lot of governments don't like it because they think that preparing for war makes them look weak, but I think that is not the case. This is no different to preparing for any other kind of disaster. What about inventories? It sounded like you were very well prepared. That is fantastic, but I will talk about it a bit more in a second. Not just your collection, but your building as well. People need to know where it is. Whether you can ask for blue shields for your buildings. I think that is actually really important. Not just because it doesn't just protect in conflict, because it raises awareness of the importance of these blue shields. And this is why Blue Shield Lebanon, for example, have put QR codes on their shield, on the blue shields. So people go, oh, what's that? And then they, then that person can find out about it. The other advantage of that is it stops people, the other advantage of a QR code is it stops people constantly asking site managers, what's this? What's this? What's this? Think about your planning, your protective measures. Where would you get your sandbags? Where would you get your wood? If you need trucks, do you all have trucks? Are you sharing trucks with other institutions? Are there enough trucks for everybody? It sounds silly, but again, this isn't something you can do by yourselves. And where are you going with the evacuation? Oh, and your storage facility, is it prepared? Do you know how to liaise with your armed forces about this? I can't help you there, but it is something worth knowing who, if there is a point of contact for that. And the more preparations you can make in advance like this, the better your protection will be. So I just want to talk very briefly about plans. It actually sounded like you were very well prepared, but obviously there are people here who didn't speak, so just in case. You need to obviously identify what is in your collection. You need an inventory for it, and you need an aid for people to help find things in it. Maps of your plan, floor plans, the location of your key objects, perhaps mark critical things with a red sticker, and then the less important things with a yellow sticker, so that in an emergency, people know where they are and that you've practiced this. It's not enough to wait until there's a fire. People need to know automatically where they are. And obviously, as somebody said earlier, very rightly, backups, and backups that are stored away from the site, but not just on servers. Because if the power goes down, and this happened in Christchurch in New Zealand with the earthquake, they had all of it stored on servers and the power went and they couldn't access the server to get the emergency plan. So you need to have physical copies as well. And you need to know who has access to them. It's not enough just for the person in charge to have all of this information, because if the worst happens on a day you're sick or ill, that's terrible. I'm not actually going to talk about inventories, except to say, did I put this on the next slide? Yes, I did. Okay, if you don't have a full inventory, then start to take photographs. You can report theft internationally just by being able to prove you had it. Take a photo with a date, date the photo. Take a description of the object with as much information as you can. It doesn't have to be a formal inventory, but if you knew nothing else, a photo on your phone and a written list that can be dated to show I had this in my collection on this day is enough. And it can be registered with the Art Loss Register in the UK, which is the only register a lot of countries are legally required to check the theft. So if your manuscript page appears on the international art market, most people will check the Art Loss Register for ownership first. So if you do nothing else, a photo on your phone and a description can work wonders to prevent it. And that's not just today, because things go on to the art market and they're stolen and then they vanish for years. And in 10 years, when the world is looking at a different conflict, so now people aren't looking at Syria, now people are looking at Afghanistan. And so people might start to try and sell Syrian antiquities because attention has moved on. those registers will still be there on the art loss register database. It's not shared, it's completely private. And I can tell you more about that later if you want to email me. And do remember, looters will separate your manuscripts into individual pages and sell them separately because they are worth more that way. Or even worse, cut them up and sell them cut up in pieces. So yeah, assess your collections, set priorities for evacuation or salvage, floor plans with photos. So these are Emily's slides again. What are your priority collections, red, orange, and yellow stickers, and try and make them very visible in case you're doing this in the dark when the power has gone. And remember flashlights, you will need a torch. Work out where you're taking things to and how secure those buildings are and how you will move them. So now I want to move to a planning exercise, which I hope this works. The idea is that you have all got this document translated in Arabic or French. This is where we find out if it fails. You've got a description for an exercise. It's very short. I don't want you to get into too many details. If you don't have the answers to the questions, or if you don't think too detailed about it, the idea is for you to come up with general risks in this scenario. Just complete the first 4 columns of this table. So the risk, how likely it is to happen, anything you think you could do about it, and what resources are needed. If it was real, you would need to make sure you knew who was responsible and who had to do it, when by. But this is not real, so don't worry about a due date. Do not worry about who would do it. I just want you to think about what the risk to your archive is, how you would mitigate it, and what resources you need to do these protection measures in these scenarios. In this scenario, I've given you a rough description of an archive. It's very small. Where your building is, a little thing about your building, and a little bit about the conflict. And then I'm going to ask you to go into your 3 breakout groups and spend about 20 minutes talking about this exercise and about the risks. We'll then all come back together after about 20 minutes. Actually, I've just seen the time. We'll all come back together after about 20 minutes with each group to feed back for 5 minutes, and then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about that. But I want to stop here and see about any questions, because we've got plenty of time now to go back over anything I've said. So if you'd like to ask questions, please do feel free. I didn't know how long this would take, and we've got about 5 minutes. No, we are about 1/4 of an hour ahead of where I thought we would be for time. So we have plenty of time to go back over anything and ask any questions before the exercise.
ممكن نتطرق لوجهة اللي هو التأمين للأشياء الموجودة بداخل المتاحف. ممكن يتم التعاون الدولي بين مؤسسات يوجد بهم معاهدة أو عقد بالحفاظ على سرية المقتنيات نسخة من الأصل. وبالنسبة للمجوهرات التي تتواجد بالمتاحف، في هذه الحالات يمكن وضع نسخة طبق الأصل والحفاظ على الأصل في مكان بعيد. فالأهمية
Yes, absolutely. But in this, so hang on. Do you mean that you would like to talk about
المخطوطات والوثائق التي تحمي الحدود الدولية لكل دولة، فهذه تتحط في الدرجة الأولى للأهمية، والمخطوطات النادرة والخرائط هم دول أساسيات للحفاظ على الدولة في حالة الحروب.
Absolutely. I hope I understand that you mean, can we talk about this as a group now rather than in the exercise? So if that is what you mean, great. Yes, definitely. The international organizations that can help you are the International Council of Archives, for yourselves most importantly, but also the International Council of Museums, the International Council of Monuments and Sites, Blue Shield, and UNESCO. And there is both the International UNESCO head office in Paris, which has an armed conflict section, but also you have the Arab Regional Office based in Cairo. And they are currently arranging training on the Hague Convention for the various states in this area, I believe. So the kinds of things to think about, though, are how much those organizations can help you in advance. So for example, there are some pots of money available to apply for, perhaps to do these kinds of measures and this kind of safeguarding. The 1999 second protocol to the Hague Convention, which is not so widely signed, but if you can persuade your country to sign it, it has an emergency fund you can apply to for measures like that. It's very useful. And all of these organizations have training they can give you. And the other thing that we can do as Blue Shield is to help store your, we can liaise with armed forces more easily than many because we are a neutral organization. And so it is easier for us to talk to people. Whereas, for example, ICOM, the International Council of Museums, or ICA, the International Council of Archives, can help you by hosting your inventories in safe places. Does that answer your questions? Because if there is also anything you would like to add, I think it's very valuable because people have a lot of experience. I wanted to open the floor at the end in the last 20 minutes, but I'm very happy to do that now as well, because there's a lot of experience in this room.
Merci à vous.
In that case, I hope you have all got this exercise in a language you can read. If you haven't, please say now. And we will otherwise move this to breakout groups as a planning exercise to see how, just to help you think through some of the armed conflict specific challenges that you could take. And then each group should have one person who will feed back for about 5 minutes, and then we can discuss it afterwards and talk about this a little bit more. Okay? Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It was interesting hearing a little bit of some of the discussions. And again, thank you to the translators. So what I wanted to do with the exercise, which is in two parts, the first part was just to help you think through the speed a conflict occurs. I know some of you, I was listening to some of the amazing and also quite terrible experiences some of you have already had dealing with disasters. And so I think it's amazing that you're able to bring that expertise to this. So what I wanted to think about was just how the conflict will be different to normal disaster to start with. Obviously, it also has some similarities, but to look at how you would protect your collection if you had just days. Just start simple. If you had just days and you were in this situation, what are the most important things you could do? And then the second question, of course, if you had more time, what would you be able to do then? And so what I would like is each group to feed back, and then perhaps we can all just talk a little bit about some of their responses of the threats and whether you think the solutions would work. Please do feel free to join in after they finished. We're coming to the end of this session, so please don't take more than 5 minutes to feed back, just to allow that little bit of time for discussion. And I'd like to ask group one to start. Thank you.
أستاذة دعاء اتفضلي اتكلمي، أنتي ممثل المجموعة.
تمام. هي المخاطر اللي حددها الفريق إنه من بداية كانت السرقة أو السرقة أو السطو المسلح، ودي احتمالية حدوثها كبيرة. تاني حاجة الحرائق المتعمدة، ودي احتمالية حدوثها برضو كبيرة. تالت حاجة الهجوم الإرهابي، برضو احتمالية الحدوث كبيرة. رقم 4 حالة رقم 4 وجود الخطر من الحشرات والقوارض، يعني اللي بتؤثر على الحالة المادية لمخطوطات مثلا، ودي حالة حدوثها متوسطة. رقم 5 الزلازل، ودي حالة احتمالية حدوثها منخفضة. جمعنا معظم المشاكل اللي موجودة ممكن نتعامل معاها، أو يعني الحلول دي كلها ممكن تتعامل مع معظم المشاكل. فأول حاجة إن إحنا يكون في تصنيف وتوثيق للمقتنيات، وعمل نسخ احتياطية وتحديد حالة المقتنيات عشان نقدر نحددها من الأهم للمهم، وضعها في صناديق في حالة عشان لو تعرضت مثلا لأمطار شديدة أو حاجة زي كده. تالت حاجة إن يكون في خطط أمنية متكاملة، يكون في منظومة أمنية متكاملة للمكان في حالات السرقة، ويكون في دورات تدريبية للعاملين أو الموجودين في المكان للتصرف في حالة حدوث مواقف سريعة. ده كان كل تقريبا المقترحات الخاصة بالمشاكل اللي ممكن يتعرض ليها المكان. شكرا.
I would definitely agree with those risk assessments, but my question is, in this scenario, you would not have time to deal with all of those. So if you had literally, like you do not have time to plan a training course, for example. So if you literally only had days, what do you think the most important things you could do would be if you only had days? Let us say that you have assessed already you have already classified your documents. So you have your most and your least important. If you only have days, what would you do?
الأهم من ناحية القيمة العلمية والتاريخية أو حاجة أقدر موثقة، يعني إن هي ذات قيمة، ده هيحدد في التصنيف. كمان لو في حالة إنه يعني كل السبل المسبقة مش غير متاحة، كان في اقتراح آخر إن هو نقل المقتنيات، خروج المقتنيات من المكان.
In the scenario, there is already looting in the streets and no police. Do you think you would be able to?
هل كان هناك مقترح أن يكون في مسارات مؤمنة، يعني تكون خطة مسبقة برضو للمسارات المؤمنة في حالة الطوارئ لخروج المقتنيات؟
So I definitely, that is the ideal, but you definitely need to be working with your guards or your security forces to arrange that in advance. And this is something I really need to highlight, is that if conflict happens, it happens very suddenly. And these are the things that might not be available. You may not have your guards, you may not have any police, the roads may be busy or unsafe. And so this is where this planning becomes critical. The other thing to flag there is the classification of documents is a very, very difficult one, as you probably know better than I do, in fact, because I don't work in archives, I'm an archaeologist. But something we do often find is the historic value is not necessarily the value others will ascribe to it. And so being careful to think about what they will value in your collection can be quite a challenge sometimes, but also quite valuable, because what becomes targeted in a conflict is not necessarily what you would protect. That is both good, because your best manuscripts or best objects stay safe, but bad because your institution is targeted where you didn't expect. But please, would anybody else like to comment on group one? Please do join in.
لا لو في عدم وجود خطة مسبقة هيبقى الأمر صعب، شديد الصعوبة في تأمين المكان من خلال العاملين داخله، لو المبنى هو المستهدف.
Very much. And thank you for going first. It is the most difficult one to be first. Okay, because of the time, I will ask group two to feedback now, and then hopefully have a slightly longer discussion at the end if we have a few minutes left.
I think if such imminent attacks would happen, and the conflict is including extremists, so we expect also the building will be looted. So I think that we could inform the government to take its responsibility to protect the items inside the building. Also, we could, if we have a number of days, we could also supported by people itself to protect or shield the building to be protected. And if we also could move some of the valuable items to a safe place, it would be beneficial. So
I like your idea to try and have support from people to increase the security for the building. I think if you're able to, that is very important. The government absolutely should take some responsibility, but just flag that those relationships need to be established well in advance. If you try and contact them once there is a crisis, they will probably be too busy or too confused. And many of the people they will send are just people. So the police are just people who, if the situation gets too bad, they will just leave. So it's not something you can rely on, but also if you have built those relationships, it puts you in a much better position. I know some other museums, for example, hold big events every year for the emergency services, for the police and for the fire services, and they invite them to their institution every year and hold them a party, just so that when there is a disaster, those people already think, oh, I must protect the museum. They have already learned of its importance and why it's so valuable. They've seen its collection. They've been inside the building. And that's actually been very, very successful because that museum is in an area with regular fires, environmental fires. So something to think about, perhaps. Again, though, if you have your extremists as a key threat, then perhaps identifying specifically in your collection the objects that might be of interest to them. So think about the looting. There's looting for value, what could be sold to collectors, but looting because, so economic value, but also looting because of its social value. What might be destroyed by extremists because they don't like it? What might be particularly valuable to them because of what it represents? And that might be quite different to the historic value, for example, to say that this is the first example of a particular manuscript or a manuscript written by somebody particularly famous. I'd also be interested to see whether all of you would focus in this situation and in the time you have about whether you would focus on your historic Islamic manuscripts or on your old administrative records, which nobody has really commented on. We might come back to that in a minute. But again, if anybody would like to comment here, please do jump in.
Hello there, my name is Mary, English speaker here. With regards to the administrative records that you cited, this is probably quite an important point because, for example, to re-establish institutional functioning, you do need to have a sense of what your institution is and who's on your employment. So these are records that are often quite dry and dull with regards to the heritage aspect or the historical aspect, but they can be very essential. They might be memorandums of agreement with government departments or institutions for assistance during the conflict, as well as the the disaster response should the building aspects of the collection be damaged or affected by the actual conflict itself.
Thank you. Yes.
One could add that your finding aids, your inventories, those are also your administrative records generally, in my understanding of where I work and such like. It might differ for some of the other participants.
That's true. When I wrote this, I envisaged it more administrative records. I envisaged them more as, for example, tax records, perhaps, or in Syria, one of the buildings that burned was the actually was one of the administrative archives, but it housed all the records of who owned which house.
Yes, I work for an archive. Sorry, carry on.
Oh, please, please.
I work for an archives in Cape Town. It's the oldest archives in South Africa. So we do also have considerable property records, which are historically important, as well as in terms of ongoing estate disputes, they are important. So yes, I do understand that, yeah.
Exactly, yes. Okay, with an eye to the time, group 3.
لقد وضعنا الترتيب بالأولوية. أولاً بالفعل البناية، لأنها هي الحامي للمحتوى ذاته. ونتيجة اللي هي تعرض أي مادة، لابد أن المواظبة على الترميم والحفاظ على المبنى. في المقام الثاني تأتي المشكلة الدولية ما بين الحكومات، وهي تعتبر متوسطة. وبالتالي يمكن حلها أو الاقتراح لحلها تكون عقود موثقة مع شركات أو مؤسسات حكومية دولية على الحفاظ على حقوق الملكية. ثالث نقطة، يتم كيفية تخزين السجلات والحفاظ على ملكيتها للدولة، فهي مشكلة كبيرة. فحلها أن يتم عمل أكثر من النسخة محفظة في مكان محفوظ، وطريقة الحفاظ لو كانت في مفاجأة لأي حدوث حرب أو حاجة، يمكن كما حدث من قبل في مخطوطات ابن سينا، تم تهريب والحفاظ على هذه المخطوطات عن بعض النسخ، سواء تم عن طريق البر أو عن طريق في حالة عدم وجود بر، فيتم عمل نفق سفلي أو مكان مخصص سري لا يعلمه إلا الحكومة ذاتها للحفاظ على هذه المخطوطات. وبالنسبة للمواصلات، نقطة إن هي البناية تبعد، وهذا الطريق يبعد عن طريق الخارجي 45 دقيقة، فلا يوجد مانع بعمل نفق سري مجهز كهربائيا لسرعة الحفاظ على هذه الآثار باطنيا لمكان بعيدا سري سريعا، لحل أن يقوم إلى إرساله إلى دولة أخرى موثوق بها بالحفاظ على هذه أهمية ملكية المخطوطات والسريات للممتلكات للبلد. أما النقطة الأخيرة اللي هي بالنسبة للسارقين أو المتطرفين، فهي حالة منخفضة في حالة فوضى أو شغب، ولا يمنع أن نحط خطط بديلة، حيث أن حين المهاجمة لهذه المؤسسة أو لهذا المبنى يكون في عمل إنذار سريعا، ويكون في أن يكون يكون في مكان تحت الأرض لفتح الأرض وتنزل هذه المنشآت وتم إخفائها وعملها في مكان عادل لا يمكن التوصل إليه عن طريق الليزر أو عن طريق الكهرباء. فبذلك يتم عدم اختراقه. في حالة تهريبها إلى منطقة دولية أخرى فنحن لدينا أرشيف موثق بالملكية. إذن في حالة عرضها في أي مزاد أو دولة أخرى يتم الإعلان فورياً عن مكان تواجد هذه المخطوطة أو الوثيقة حتى لو مر عليها مر أعوام كثيرة، لأن ما يسرق يحفظ لمدة طويلة في الخزائن الشخصية. بس
I think there were some very good, very important points there, and some new ones. I like that each group has brought some new important points. One thing because of the time, we don't have much discussion time, sadly. But the one thing I would like to highlight there is taking objects internationally is great if you can, but you have two problems just to be aware. One is that you can only take your objects to another country if you already have an agreement in law with that country. So, for example, if you want to give your objects to America or the UK, you need to have what is called a bilateral agreement with that country already in advance, and they are not quick to prepare. So if you think about who your allies are that might take your objects, make sure you already have those agreements. And perhaps that is one of the key things to highlight here, is that all of your plans are good and they are strong. But when conflicts happen, they happen in a day, a month. They are very fast and almost always very unexpected. So make sure that all of the ideas that you've shared today are ones that you go away and start putting into practice now, because otherwise you will find you don't have the time. Because I have 1 minute, I'm just going to share one last thing, which is that at the end of your exercise document, after the exercise, there is a list of resources. The cataloging base, most of these you will be familiar with. These ones are good though. There is a first aid in conflict planning sheet. It is in English. There's a risk management guide in 3 languages, and the actual legal convention in 3 languages to help you have a look as well at your responsibilities. And then lastly, just to give you my email for any questions. I realize this was very short and we did not have much time, but like I said, it was just an introduction. And if you want to ask further questions or talk to me, please do email me at blueshield.international@theblueshield.org. And there's the emergency management archive group link is here as well. I'm just going to copy them into the chat for you to copy as the last thing I do. Maybe. What have I not done? And with that, I'm afraid it is 6 o'clock, I think, in your time, most of you. Maybe not in Africa, but It's been a pleasure, and if I can help in any other way, please do let me know. And I wish you all a pleasant evening.